I love this. I love the idea, the notion that your words create world. And so your words are creating the world that you're in. And so you get to live that life, the life of your words.
Hey there, and welcome to the Unleash Your Greatness Within podcast. In today's success interview, it was my privilege to interview Gary John Bishop.
Passion and my mission to help you unleash your greatness within. My heart goes out to the underdogs that's on their way. If you think you can go from good to great, okay, let's motivate. Greatnesswithin.com. DJ Hoisington. Greatnesswithin.com.
You see, Gary wrote this book, Grow Up, Becoming the Parent Your Kids Deserve. And when I read that title and the subtitle, it caught my attention. Of course, this is something I truly value, becoming the best parent I can be, raising the best kids I can raise, possibly, hopefully. I think we're on the right track. I tell you what, Gary points out a number of life truths that are critical about becoming all that you're capable of becoming and becoming whole yourself so that you can offer that to someone else. This book is powerful. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, hey, I invite you to subscribe and make sure you click that notification bell so that you're notified every time I come out with a new success interview like this. Because you see, I get the good fortune of interviewing people like Gary, New York Times bestselling authors, business leaders, celebrities, professional athletes, and much, much more. And if you've downloaded this from the Apple Podcast, thank you for being a part of my community, right? My goal is to help you unleash your greatness. So thank you for listening to me, following me wherever you are. And I promise to continue bringing you thought-provoking interviews and thoughts and ideas that can help you get to the next level. Now, with any further ado, let's jump right into this interview. Gary, welcome to the Unleash Your Greatness Within podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, TJ.
Absolutely. Listen, this is the second time you've been on the show. I'm grateful that you're on the show. Today's interview will be centered around grow up, becoming the parent your kids deserve. And it's that subtitle that really grabbed my attention when your publicist reached out to me. I was like, I totally believe in that statement. I want to hear all that you have to say about it. I'll let the audience know right now that you can't see all this, but I have gone through and highlighted all kinds of stuff in here. So we're going to have a great interview. So just to get started, Gary, would you do us a favor and give us a little bit of your biography, a little bit of your backstory?
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Glasgow, Scotland, but I've lived in the States for 28 years, even though I'm doing this interview from Germany, believe it or not. But this is my sixth book. And my first book was a New York Times bestseller. It sold millions of copies, called Unfu Yourself. And in every book that I've written, all of my books are, taking a deep dive into what it is to be a human being, how to be more effective at being you, and getting rid of some of that junk that can kind of gather in our minds and in our spirit over a lifetime. So and it's all my work is based in two very kind of distinct parts of philosophy, that is ontology and phenomenology. I wouldn't profess to be an expert in either of those particular distinctions, but it's certainly where I lean into when constructing my work and my ideas and some of those principles that I write about.
Yeah, and in your biography, I'm just going there now. You kind of have correct me if I'm wrong, the term. Okay, here it is. Your approach is an urban philosophy. Right. So
right.
You do have a special way of capturing the essence of what it means to be a human being, of true principles wrapped up in your own style, which is a unique style, which I love, by the way.
Yeah. I think, I love philosophy. My problem with philosophy is that it's kind of a little too interested in itself. It's kind of like, it's philosophy kind of eats itself. It's
Mm-hmm.
people who indulge in philosophy. It's just all about philosophical concepts and theories. Whereas, and it's interesting enough, but for me, I look to philosophy for answers. I look to philosophy for real insights. And when I find those, I want to present them to people in a way that they can access it, that they can open a door and get into it themselves.
Right.
And to be honest, there's just there's no use in like I said, like showing off how philosophically astute you are if nobody else is getting the benefit out of it. So that's always my game. My game is always present people with these ideas, these notions, in a way that resonate with them. They're like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. But not only resonate, they can use it, and that's critical. I mean, philosophy for your everyday person.
I love it. And you're all about change. I feel like I'm all about change. I don't want to just be on stage telling great stories. I want it to move people to do something different. And it sounds like that's also your style too. But let's jump into the book. I mean, holy cow, this is Grow Up. How to be like becoming the parent your kids deserve. What does that mean?
Yeah. One of the things, look, I spend a lot of my time pondering. I really do. I spend a lot of time in thinking about life and people and situations. And there's been this kind of growing conversation in society for about the last 5 years, maybe 10, but it's getting louder and louder in social media. People talking about breaking a generational chain. And every time I hear it, I just think of the arrogance of that statement. And it always struck me as a very arrogant statement, like, this is the first generation ever to try that, right?
Yeah.
And the reality is, every single generation has tried to break the chain. Okay. There has been no generation that hasn't tried that, right? No one's out to perpetuate what happened 20 years ago. Everybody's trying to get better. And so your parents did it, your grandparents did it, your great-grandparents did it, your great-great-grandparents did it. Every one of them made an effort to break a generational chain. And each one of them, in their own way, failed, right? It will, just like this generation will. It'll fail. And the reason it'll fail is because there's only two ways that we raise our children. You're going to do one or the other of these. You're either going to raise them the way you were raised, and you'll try and replicate some of those items from your past, or you're going to do the opposite. You're going to experience what you experienced, and you're going to say, I'm not doing that. I'm going to do this instead. Now, the reality is both of those are past-based phenomena. So that means they're both based in the past. And that's what your children will do. Your children will use a past-based methodology, if you like, of raising your grandchildren, and so on all the way through. And it flips from generation to generation. That's why it keeps perpetuating. We keep persisting in the same kind of outcomes, if you like. So I was really to write a book that dived right into that actually took that particular bull by the horns and said, look, if you want to actually engage in a conversation for breaking a generational chain, one of the first things you'll have to realize and come to terms with is you're going to perpetuate it. And that's kind of like those words, but that is the point of the early part of that book, is to say, look, you're going to follow the exact same path.
Does that mean we shouldn't look to the past and say this was done maybe wrong, or it could have been done better, and then through learning been enlightened in such a way that I now coach my children to maybe take a different path, or at least consider the downside of going down that path? I mean, that's appropriate, isn't it?
Well, here's what I want people to get. You can choose a path, and you should choose a path, okay, the way you're going to raise your children. But here's what you'll need to realize. They're not going to take out of that path what you think they might.
Fair.
So the first thing you have to realize is that, your children are going to do what you did. So they're going to see the way, they're going to witness the way that you raised you raised them, just like you did with your own parents. And again, I go through this in the book. I actually talk about some of those phases where I say there's a point in every child's life where they start to criticize the job their parents are doing, right? Or rather critique the job their parents are doing. And they start to form like all the things that they would do better. Like, I would do this different. That's already happening by about 12.
Yeah, that's
right? 11,
that's
12,
way that's
13,
that,
about that
yeah,
age.
that's wave number 2. You have wave number 1,
Wave number 2.
Number 2. Yeah. And
Right.
they start and
So-
the words you
so what
use in the
happens
book.
is-
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Well, no, the word you use in the book is cynicism. They get to 12 years old or so, and they look at hypocrisy. They look at every chink in the armor. They focus on it. Oh man. And then there's wave 3, of course, as well. Anyway.
Well, if you follow the book, right? If the first thing I think people need to get is you don't necessarily have to have children to read this book, because
absolutely.
it really is about your own childhood, and perhaps looking at that in such a way that it might change the way that you see your own parents or your grandparents. It might shift it. In fact, it will if you do the work. Now, but the interesting thing is, to me anyway, there's certain decisions that we all made growing up, right? That we have no real cognitive sense of having made those decisions. We're not keyed into every decision we make in life. So in the book, I talk about trauma, right? For instance, and I say everybody's traumatized. And by that, I mean, trauma isn't necessarily objectively traumatic. Trauma is simply an element, a time in a person's life, their very young life, when something happens that changes the trajectory of that life. Sometimes these moments are very, very subtle. And so in this book, I wanted to get people to start to dive into their own past and see, well, hold on a minute. Where did I start that? For instance, we were talking about the second wave there. When did I start becoming cynical? When did I start casting a cynical eye to those around me to judge what they're doing and what they're not doing?
Right.
Are my children going through that right now? Or have they gone through it? And what was the impact of that on them and on us as a family? So it really is for people to start to see a much more kind of cohesive understanding of how it works when we're growing up, how it was for your parents growing up, to be parented by your grandparents. What was that like? Because, another thing I'm going to really dispel is some of those kind of sacred cows we have in terms of our opinions of our parents, which people, they don't want that mess with. So I'm clear that this book is going to mess with some of that.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, and I would say, when I was reading the book, I couldn't help but think about you moved to America in 1997, if I read that correctly. So correct anything that I say. And then you dove into some personal development. That was about close to the time I dove into personal development. So by the time I reached my teenage years, I was already diving into forward-thinking ideas and abundance mindset and don't be the victim and so forth type concepts. So I don't think I ever, looking back on when I was reading your book, I was like, nope, I get it. I never blamed my parents. I took the good that I could take from them, and hopefully I could build upon that without criticizing them in the process. Sure, there was, during that wave, there was probably a little stint where I was pushing back and a little cynical and so forth. But as I got past that second wave, I think I started to see clearer and clearer that blaming and being the victim, which is, I think, chapter number 2. Talk about blame for a second.
Right. So blame is not always obvious either. So blame can be very, very subtle. It's not always this kind of steaming, streaming, noise of you did this and you did that. Often you'll find blame woven into your explanations. So when you explain something, right, and for you as a human being, or anyone as a human being, because I'm speaking in general terms here, sure, we'll just say, well, this is what it was like, right? Now, there might be elements of truth in your explanation, but you'll also see woven in there will be, well, this happened, and then that happened, and then this happened. And that explanation becomes part of that narrative. that narrative is not a conscious construct, right? That narrative is a subconscious construct put together over years and years and years. And so what I want people to understand is some people had like very, very challenging childhoods where terrible things happened, right? And some of it was perpetuated by their own parents, okay?
That's right.
And in the book I talk about, there's really only two things you can do with that, right? There's really only two modes that we have to deal with our past. That is one of being the repentant sinner. So that is, you did it, and now you want to kind of deal with yourself to get over doing what you did, right? Or you're going to be this kind of forgiveness person where I'm just going to forgive those, right? So you're either going to be the recovering victim or the repentant sinner. And so what I wanted people to get is both of those are completely unnecessary when you deal with the foundational piece of it all. And the foundational piece of it all is blame. Now, like I said, blame can be very subtle. It can also be very obvious, right? You can hear somebody speaking sometime and you're like, yeah, you're just blaming them or blaming this. So what I wanted people to start confront was, can you deal with your past and remove blame? Can you actually look back there and look at the whole thing and don't blame yourself, don't blame anybody, don't blame the timing you were born, don't blame, this thing or that thing. Right. Some people might use it as an explanation, like I said. But see if you can take that out. And here's what you notice. When you remove blame, when you stop talking about those things in terms of who did what, there's really not a lot left to say, right? And so something like forgiveness becomes easy. And as long as blame's in there, you'll never have an easy access to forgiveness. No way. You'll end up with this kind of self-righteousness. Like, I'm better than you, so I forgive you. You like that kind of deal, which isn't really forgiveness, right? Real forgiveness is simply when you get to a point where you're saying, I am no longer willing to punish either myself or that other person. That's what it comes down to. And when you and the easier, like I said, the quickest way to get there is to confront the kind of temptation of blame.
True, but that's a huge mindset shift. I mean, we're surrounded in our world with all kinds of information, data, and so forth that almost
massive
repeats the idea that it's okay to blame, it's okay to be the victim, right? And I feel like in my own home, I'm making sure with my children, right, we're pushing against that and believing good is all around us, that there's enough pie, if you will, for everybody. And it's about how you look at the world. Yeah. And part of the blame thing is that in the book, good book, you were talking about what were the stories we tell. You say that it's not when we reflect on our past, and we have a feeling associated or a belief associated with it, we are not describing what is. We're describing what we came up with a story or a narrative about that instance.
Right. Right. So when neuroscience will tell you this, every time you recollect a memory, you only recollect the memory of the last time you remembered it. Right. So if you just think about that for a moment, like, you don't have memories. You have memories of 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 memories, all the way back to the incident. The problem with all of that is whatever you might have a memory about, something you can't get past about from your past, right? The thing you really need to start understanding is, for you, that's the truth, right?
Yeah,
that's the truth.
That's right.
Right. But the for you part is very challenging, because people are firmly trying to establish that as the truth. Right. Now, there are clearly, for people's lives, right? I don't want us to sound like, like we're being kind of flippant with some of the things that people had to deal with in their life. But at the same time, you have to realize, no matter the incident, no matter how, or incidents or things that happened in your childhood, those things are not, when you talk about those things, you do not talk about the thing that happened. You talk about your experience of the thing that happened, right? Which lingers, by the way, right? That's what lingers, right? Not the thing that happened, but your experience of the thing that happened. And so I say to people, well, what if you could question what you left yourself with about that? Yeah. Now, that question, what if you could question what you left yourself with? That's the confronting one, because people don't feel like they left themselves with anything. They felt as if that time or that situation or that incident is what left them with it. When the truth of it is, what you've done over time in the confines of your own mind, the way you describe that, that's your narrative, or that's your story here, a very popular word to use in our industry, your story. Yeah. It's not to diminish it. It's to let you see that what you've got is a version of events. And so in this book, I'd take you in and I say, let's question it.
Yep.
Let's question the story. And that can be very confronting for people, because they've built a life around being victorious over it. And so this is why I called it Grow Up. I called the book Grow Up because how can you expect to be the parent that you want to be, or rather the parent that your children deserve, while you're still trying to navigate your way through whatever incompletions you might have from your own childhood? And so we take this kind of multi-generational look through the eyes of what it's like to be your child, what it's like to be you, and what it was like to be your parents. And in that is when you start to see like the thread that goes through. And so if you're really interested in breaking some of that multi-generational stuff up, it's that thread that you need to get your eyes on, rather than all this yo-yoing back and forth between what the last one did, and on and on and on into the future.
That's one thing that's really great about the book is the principles in this book, yes, will make you, will help you, enable you with the tools to be a better parent, starting with self-realization of certain things that you've already discussed. But listen, a leader in a company should be reading this book, an adult, a manager, a supervisor, a church leader. I'm just saying it's not just about parenting. It's about becoming, as you say toward the end of the book, becoming a whole person. You use it, I'm jumping ahead here, but you say at the end of the book, if you're driving on a bridge that's partly broken, you would stop, make sure you fix the bridge properly before you go over it. And I think that's sort of the first half, well, the whole book, but definitely the first half of the book is all about figuring some of that stuff out, which is very bold. It's very intrusive, but in I think in your style, a gentle way to make you look at your past in a new perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that a lot of people think, they just kind of flippantly look at their past and say, hey, it made me the person I am today, right? Well, what a bumper sticker, right? Just what a way to get yourself off the hook for something, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I say, yeah, but what about that? Like, what about all of that, right? Like, what still grinds your gears? Like, what still eats away at you? What are the things that you get challenged by in life right now? And when you get into it, you can draw a straight line from that thing you're wrestling with today in your childhood. You can draw a straight line, like, let's go back and let's see what that's like, because we get stuck in these repetitive ways of being and ways of acting. And so being a parent, this is why I said it's the most challenging thing you'll ever face, because what it does is it throws up all of those things, right? So again, not even all the negative things. You could have had a great childhood. Yeah, that becomes the standard that you must now bear. So now you've got to try and replicate that for your own children. That becomes a burden too, right? That becomes a pressure, like, oh, my mom and dad did such a great job. Because in the background of all parents, if you get right underneath all the dirt, they all want the same thing. And that is, they don't want to screw this up. Yeah, they want this to turn out. They want their children to turn out. And it's another thing in the book that I wanted people to know. All parents want that. And not all parents go about it the right way, and not all parents, some parents really screw that up. But the intent was there at the beginning, and these things go off track for a multitude of reasons as I get into in the book. But so I don't want people to be fooled into thinking, oh, a lot of this work I don't have to do. Listen, as you just pointed to, everybody has to do this kind of work. You want to see how you ended up in this little trail. You want to see how this narrative is played out the good ways that it's played out, because it was played out in good ways. But you also want to look at the other ways where it's holding you down and it's kind of gotten your way and specifically in this book, how is it influencing your relationship with your own children or your parents, even to this day? So yeah, it's an interesting subject to get into, but it's not one without confronting.
Well, I mean, you weaved throughout the entire book has a lot to do with that narrative. And I had a quote whenever I really like something that you say, I highlight it and then I put double check marks next to it. And one of those double check marks was this, and it was about truth on page 50. For what it's worth, this is what you say. For what it's worth, I completely question the legitimacy that what you've been telling yourself is, you put in quotations, what you've been telling yourself is true about your past. I question your truth. That's because anyone's truth is malleable, even yours. And here's the reality. If you're operating, well, you tell me if you agree with this or haven't a thought about it. If whatever your truth is, based on a series of life experiences and so forth, you've adopted a certain narrative, story, whatever that truth is going to govern your behavior.
Yeah.
What I've tried to do, Gary, is make sure that if that's your truth, that understand that results take time to measure. So maybe the truth is working in the moment to satisfy a need or a passion or something, but will it serve you long term? And as I got deeper into the book, the focus is the long term, right? I mean, let's make these changes.
Well, of course. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. I mean, look, if you think about the way we all are as adults, okay, so the way we all are, you weren't born the way you are, okay, you've become this way.
Yes.
For over years, for a multitude of different reasons, right? But if you try on the idea that who you've become, you've only become that person as a compensation for certain experiences of your childhood. So all of it, I really mean like all of it is a compensation, right? So that doesn't mean it's all bad, right? It doesn't mean it's all terrible, because some of it is powerful and useful, right? And so we have certain, as I would call it, default ways of being that are very powerful, right? And we all have our own, and we have like a handful of them, and we turn to them in our lives to make our lives work. Some people are very charismatic. Some people are very competitive. Some people are very hardworking. Some people are very compassionate. But you weren't born that way. You were born, you could be that way, but you could be lots of different ways when you're little. You have a freedom to be when you're 2 and 3 that you don't have that freedom when you're 28. You're not free to be at 28. You're only free to be who you've become. Who you've become as a human being is as a product of that story, that narrative that was built up over those early couple of decades of your life. Because if you think about it, you're born, you come into this world, this chaotic, crazy world, and everything's new and it's coming at you. Yeah, you better find yourself some markers to make sense of this so that you're prepared for the future. Those markers, that's your story. That's what you've bound your life to. and you'll bind your parenting to it also. And so this book is really about so that you get to see that for sure, but then you can maybe start to get to see, oh my gosh, my children are right in the middle of this right now. And oh my gosh, my parents went through this. For a lot of people, what I want to get is, I promise you, when you read this book, your parents will make more sense to you. You'll be like, oh, well, now, duh, right? And again, good, bad, and indifferent parents. So, yeah, that multi-generational approach, though, is so critical so that you can start to see how the threads work and how they're passed on from generation to generation.
Let's talk about language. You talk about having a whole chapter on having a fresh perspective. And in that chapter, you talk about language we use. You say on page 69, talking about yourself, and you in the book, you're reflecting on yourself. You said, I had to get out of the addiction of seeing the world through my eyes, my situation, my pain, my story, and the life I thought I should have had. Right.
So I'll kind of give you like a really kind of brief synopsis of kind of what we do, right? So the first 20 years of your life is about understanding what you're dealing with, right? The next 10 to 15 years is the strategy you've come up with to deal with what you found out in the first 20, right?
Yep.
Then you hit like 35, 37, 40, and you think, what the, right? You're like, how did I end up here? This is not how. So some people would call that the midlife crisis. I call that time in a person's life the bankruptcy of self. It's when you realize that you've become is not gonna get it done. And it's shocking for many people. It's a surprising and shocking event in one's life. So in this book, I talked about, there was definitely a time in my life when I realized, like, oh my gosh, like it was the first time in my life I'd ever seen the character that I'd become. I'd never seen the character, Sometimes I'll tell people, go onto social media and watch the way you interact and watch what bothers you and what excites you and what makes you laugh. And then just imagine the kind of person who all of that appeals to. That's the character you've become. You were not born that character. And so those little moments of distance, for me, it's like distance when I can step back and see myself. And, I did talk about that kind of perspective. We talk a lot about perspective in life. Well, that's a person's perspective, or this is my perspective. What I want people to understand is your perspective isn't that. It's not narrow like the way that word sounds. Perspective is like a world you're in. You're in a world of something. And so you engage with life from that world. You use the logic that's appropriate to that world that you're in, right? And so when you can kind of get outside of that world and see you doing that, see yourself doing that, it's a massive eye-opener. It's a transformational time, because then you start to see why maybe you haven't been as fulfilled or happy or satisfied in your life, and maybe why you've been bumping up against some of the things you've been bumping up against in life.
Love it. And with those perspectives come the words we use. You talk about that in the book. So I always say words trigger images, which trigger emotion, which then trigger behavior, which ultimately determines the destiny. And I know that's a very narrow, simple way of viewing it. But here's the reality. The words we use predict and perpetuate performance. And you say on page 70, you say, quote, you may notice, you're reflecting on yourself again, you may notice I'm not saying how any of that stuff made me feel. That phrase you will never hear me say anymore. That doesn't belong in my vocabulary. So you're separating in the book there, if I remember correctly, certain phrases we say, words we say that aren't serving us. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah. So again, it's a very, if you go about your everyday life, you'll hear people say, made me feel, right? So the way they said that made me feel right. Or every time I see that person, it makes me feel blah, blah, blah. Or every time this thing happens, or that smell, or that sound. In the book, I reference a couple of philosophers who were very much, specialists, if you like, in the whole domain of language and being. And I talked about Heidegger in it. And Heidegger said language is the house of being.
Yes.
And what did he mean by that? He meant how you speak is how you be. Right? There's and neuroscience has backed this up, by the way, all the way up to now. Like, I had a brilliant conversation a few weeks ago with a clinical psychologist about this. And, like I was talking about philosophical ideas from 100, 200, 250 years ago. And that person was breaking down like all the kind of latest insights in neuroscience and in psychology that completely validate, right, what some of these people were saying. But so you speak, and it's how you authentically every day speak is how you be. And so I noticed that for sure that simple phrase made me feel was in fact creating a dynamic between me and whatever I'm saying that thing or this person made me feel. And here's the dynamic. I'm the victim here. I'm being done unto. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not saying people aren't victimized. I'm not saying people aren't the victims of certain things, but there's really no point in voluntarily victimizing yourself, right? Yeah. There's no point in continuing to create these dynamics in your everyday life in language. And you will have to live with the language you use, by the way. There's no point in adding to that, like to creating scenarios in your life where, you're, like I said, you're being done unto, because that has a cumulative effect on a human being. I have these conversations with my 18-year-old son all the time. Like I'll say, and he's so generous, he's so gracious, he'll let me talk to him in that way. Yeah, totally. But I'll say, like, hey, did you notice like the way you phrased that to me? And he'll be like, oh, no, I didn't. I'll say, all right, well, just take a look at it and tell me what you see. And then he'll be like, oh my gosh, I totally am. Like I'm framing myself content. And one of the things that he noticed, by the way, when he frames it that way, in his mind, he had told himself it makes him more determined. Right, makes them more competitive. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. When you're 18, that's exactly what I'll do. Now imagine what it'll do to you by the time you're 52.
Yeah, exactly.
And he was like, oh yeah, like it could become a way of life, right? So yeah, the language we use, TJ, is critical and requires consideration. It requires you to notice these things, just how easily, because we're always framing life. We're always communicating. We're communicating our actions, communicating our speaking. I love the idea, the notion that your words create world. And so your words are creating the world that you're in. And so you get to live that life, the life of your words.
Gary, love that. Let me tell you, when I wrote in 2004, If You Think You Can, it was all about these thought processes, or in your terms, these worlds we create that become our reality. Well, hey, let me ask you this, and I'm wondering where you're, because I have a 25-year-old who's married, 2 grandchildren now. I have a 23-year-old married, they're doing great, boys. Then we took a 6-year break. I have a senior daughter who's a senior in high school this year, and I have another daughter after a short break who's in 8th grade right now. I've learned a few things along the way, but one thing I tried to establish when you talk about markers and principles early on in this interview, and maybe you just give me your take on this, and I've never shared this before, Gary, but there are 3 words we do not use. We do not use in the culture of our home. They are considered bad words. I know there's judgment there, but it's because I want to impress a value. Here are the three words. We never use the words or phrase, I'm depressed. So the D word is depressed. I feel depressed. Or today I woke up and I kind of feel depressed. We do not loosely throw if you're really depressed, then that's one thing, but you got to keep it in its place, because what people end up doing is they use these words freely and then they wonder why they're more frequently feeling depressed. That's number one. We don't use that word depressed in our home when we try to explain a feeling. Number two, and this might throw some people off, I don't know, because we don't use the word divorce. We don't get mad at our spouse or my wife or my children's wives, right? I taught them ever since they was probably started at 5, 6, 7 years old. This is a word you don't use. When you get upset with them, you don't say, well, maybe our relationship is over. Maybe we should just get a divorce, right? And then you say that for years and never get a divorce. What good does that do? I'm not saying that there's a place to get divorced or not get divorced. There are obviously situations in life where those probably make sense. But if you don't want that to happen, and I've now been going on my 26 years of marriage, one thing is we've never thrown that word around, number one, as a threat or as maybe an innuendo or whatever. And then the last thing is we eliminate the word can't. I can't do it, right? Those are the three words we don't, and it's the whole goal of all that is as a parent, I've seen my goal as a guardrail, not the driver of their lives. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first thing that I want people to get, and because people will often do this, they'll hear, we live our lives like the language we use describes, right? So we live our lives like the feeling came first and then the language described it. The situation came and the language described it. Neurologically, the feeling and the language arise at the same moment. So you got to get the neurons that are firing, right? It's been a long time since I actually read the paper on this, and I can't recollect the actual paper when I read this. It was a long time ago. But neurologically speaking, like language and being are happening in the same moment. So as you speak it, there you be it, right? So that is all the emotional states, moods, outlook. Yep. It's all arising together. Now, sometimes when people hear a conversation like this, like, oh no, but then what you're saying is don't talk about it. And I say, no, but number one, be responsible for the language you're using. And number two,
correct.
Try and be a little more accurate, right? Try and be a little more accurate. So I'll use your example, right? I'm depressed. It's not specific. It's kind of vague, right? Tell me exactly how you feel then. How do you feel? Like, I feel like I have no power this morning. I feel like I've no get up and go. Okay, that's a little bit more specific for me. Right. Or for instance, like, people throw around that term, right? Like, then I'll get divorced or whatever. You're starting to introduce that conversation into the situation, but it's really like something to wound, right? When people start using that term, initially, right? It's to wound. It's to make it, an incision in the middle of a conversation. So language, you're always creating your reality in language, and which is very different, by the way, from positive language, which sometimes people can't really take to that because they feel as if it doesn't feel authentic to them. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the way you automatically speak and the way you automatically speak about your life, every day, speaking to yourself, speaking to others, those are the default ways of being that are there for you. You constraints of those stories that you're in of your everyday life, like, I hate my job. Okay, do you think you just get away with happiness then, when you start to formulate that? So I say to people, you might be dissatisfied with your job. Okay, then maybe you should think about changing it.
Yeah.
If you're saying I'm dissatisfied and I'm staying, good, then you should embrace the choice.
Yes.
So these little things are like, and it might be a shitty choice for you. You might feel like, I don't want to do this job, and I feel as if I feel like I've got no choice. But we do have choice. It's just not always comfortable. It's just not always convenient. And sometimes it's unbelievably inconvenient. but sometimes those are the only choices to make. So again, it's one of those things with people that I wanted them to understand, like, we think we are looking at reality and just talking about it, and we don't get that as we're speaking, we are formulating a reality that we get to exist in. So I say to people, you might have the experience of, when you were born, you're thrown into this life, as Heidegger would have called it. You're thrown into it, right? And you might say, well, I had no say in that. Yeah, but you have a say in your experience of it. That's where you have the say, and your experience arises and falls in the language of it.
So my wife gets annoyed because I check people on the language they use. And I get that it's not always my place to do it, but going on 50 this year, when I'm at the cash register or I'm talking to someone in the hallway or whatever, and I hear them use phrases that are demeaning, blame, victim, I will stop them and say that again. Is that what you really mean? What do you really mean there? And then they get into more accuracy, which is what you're talking about, more specifics. And I said, why don't you just say that? Why don't you just be more accurate in what you're saying, more descriptive in what you're saying, instead of just throwing this out there? And it throws a lot of people off. And my wife gets upset because it's not my place to correct people, which is true. It's not my place. But I want to remind people there's a better world out there if we didn't speak like that. Anyway. Well,
if you start with the idea, because look, I know people are in some really tough situations in life. They are. There's no getting away from that. This isn't some, Pollyannish, approach to living life, right? I mean, people are dealing with a reality. Like, if you're a single mom right now, right, and you're 21 and your parents are drug addicts, or you didn't know your parents, and we're sitting here talking about language, trying to speak a bit more, positively, you can get how people might be like it would stick in their throat a little, right?
I agree.
But what I want people to start with is to say, language creates, right? Now, you might think, no, like I said earlier, I feel as if I'm just commenting on the situation. No, I want you to get in those moments when those words are falling out of your mouth, you are creating your own experience of it. Now, that doesn't mean to say you can live in la la land and say, oh, no, this is all amazing, right, when you're just about to get evicted, right? But there are ways of looking at it and saying, okay, this is a big challenge for me. Okay, good. That's very different from I'm screwed.
Yeah.
Right? Now, again, those subtle, it doesn't change the reality. It changes your experience of the reality. And so, and in your experience of the reality, the more empowered you are, the more empowered you'll be to deal with it. So the language you use is absolutely critical, and the subtleties of that language are not to be minimized. They're that you can, your whole experience of something can shift in a word. As I like to say to people, there's a massive difference between fire and firefly, and don't get the two of them mixed up.
So, and when you do shift those words just a little bit, it opens up a new set of choices, right? By changing those words, and maybe you can't do it on your own. Maybe you need to find better input, better associations, read a new book, maybe on the concept or whatever. What's worked in the past may not continue to serve you in the future unless you change what's feeding the mind, what questions you're asking, what words you're using. All of a sudden, I mean, I have coached people where maybe the leader in the company tells me about, in a private conversation, about their spouse who's always depressed. When we talk through this stuff, he tells me, TJ, I've been using some of these concepts with her. I'm seeing her as she's capable of becoming. I'm speaking to her in a different way. I'm rewarding behavior differently than what I gave attention to in the past. And you know what? She's now got a job. She's now focused on some things. She's changed her perspective. And that's from someone else. Imagine if I was you
Right.
or me or someone else was communicating with that person. Just giving a different view of the world can change the whole world experience. Anyway, that's the
For
world.
sure. For sure.
Okay, let's move forward. You say here, that's pretty bold, and I agree with it. You say, quote, "Let me say this as plainly as possible. All control is driven by fear."
Right.
Control.
Right. So I had this interaction with someone a long time ago. I'm not a psychologist, obviously, it's not my field, but I had this conversation with a mental health professional a long time ago, and I said, "Control's a perspective, right?" And they said, "That's a dangerous thing to say because people have controlling parents." And I said, "That's a view of your parents." And they're like, "No, no, no." So they wanted to argue a kind of objective and subjective phenomenon. So an accurate way to say that might have been, in my experience, my parents were controlling. Okay, I get that. That makes total sense to me. But the statement, "my parents are controlling," that's subjective, being stated as objectivity. So what I wanted people to understand is what you might be experiencing as control, right, is driven by somebody else's fear. And that changes the dynamic there. It's sort of get like, oh, it's less about control and more about fear. Let me speak to the fear. Why would I speak to the fear? Because it's at the source of the control. What most people do is argue with the control, which only elicits more control because it doesn't deal with the fear. So I wanted people to really understand, like, what drives control. If you have people around you who demonstrate those kind of tendencies and behaviors where they feel as if they have to take care of this and that and this and that and checking in with you and making sure and it's all driven by fear, right? And so, especially when it comes to parents, you see a lot. There's a kind of underlying text there, I guess, I wanted people to get, and I wanted parents to get, is we spend a lot of our parenting trying to make sure certain things don't happen, as opposed to what are we creating here? And so that's when you end up in that trap of control. And again, that fear comes from your own childhood and your own incompletions, and it just creates that nasty life. So yeah, control is all of it, all control, at the level of the individual, the group, by fear.
Well, let me ask you this, Gary. Are you suggesting, I don't think you are, but are you suggesting that we as parents don't put forward, I wrote down certain values, rules, expectations? Are you saying let everybody kind of run their own course without any sort of borders or discipline or anything?
No, I'm saying you can do all of that, but don't be attached to it, because, there's a real good chance your children might at some point anyway either reject it or simply determine that it's not for them. Like, it's just, they've decided to adopt something else. So, it's one of the great nature versus nurture debates. If imposing your values on your children worked, we wouldn't have the society we've got. So it just doesn't work because of the simple mechanism that's at play. Your children will either, so you might demonstrate your values, but when we talked about that cynical lie, right? And I said, your children see through all that at some point. They see you're either going to walk the walk or you're not. And if you're not going to walk your talk, then they see it. So that's when that cynicism kicks in. And, I talked about Sartre, the French existentialist. Sartre said, we make meaning in life. And that's what human beings do. They add meaning to everything. So even if you think you're doing a good job, your children are putting good things in, they're going to ascribe their own meaning to that. That doesn't mean to say you don't do that. You should do that, right? You should raise your children in a way that you think is appropriate. But you should also realize that that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to adopt all of that for themselves.
True.
And sometimes that's a great source of upset in families, is because parents insist that their children should, again, all driven by fear, right? Like, I don't want, it's an amazing amount of times, parents will go through certain testing times with their children, and, that may be doing one thing or another thing at a certain age. And in a parent's mind, they just see a straight line to the state penitentiary, like, this is not going to go well. And the kid's only 10, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of ground to happen between now and then. So I guess some of this is to kind of have parents be a little more understanding of their process, like what they're going through. Even though you might have forgotten what you went through as a child, they're going to get through some of these spaces. It's okay. It's okay if you just kind of stay true, stay settled. You don't have to force it. You'll see it'll come. It'll eventually, what'll come out of it will be a child who's empowered, or a young person who's empowered to formulate life on their terms. I think that's way more powerful than you better formulate your life on my terms.
100%. That's control. I don't want my kids to duplicate my life. I want them to, but what I do want to do is provide them with some tools. Like, for example, be respectful to people, be kind. That's a value, right? You can get further ahead by being nice. In every instance, maybe not, but most of the time, hey, being positive, being kind, smiling a little bit more, that will make a difference. Another one, when you're working for someone or you're doing something, one thing that I would impress upon my kids constantly is you give your best. You work hard. You don't loaf off. You don't do the bare minimum.
Right.
You give your very best. So these are tools. Now, like you're saying, TJ, in the end, they're going to accept it or not. But I feel like as a parent, that's my role, to establish some of these things that over time for many people have served to be positive values. And then they have to figure out, like you said, how to adopt that in their own reality, their own story, their own narrative, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the important thing there is, and it's actually critically important. Remember when I went back to earlier on when I said, the thing that drives us as parents is we don't want to screw this up. That is, we don't want our children to have terrible lives.
For sure.
So everything you're trying to give them is what you think, what we believe is, you do this and you got a better shot at a good life, right? I mean, that's at the source of it all. And that's when I got into that subject of authenticity, right? Authenticity is, so whatever you're trying to instill your children there, that's fine. That's completely appropriate. But what really empowers them is to say, here's why I'm putting this in with you. This is what I've learned. This is what I've seen.
Yes.
And as a parent, it's important to me that you're equipped. So everything that I'm doing here is to equip you.
Totally
I want you to be equipped. You might find new things along the way that serve you better. That's okay. But this is my take on it. Now, that's authentic parenting. That's you're saying, look, I don't have all the answers. I'm going to be honest. I don't have all the answers.
That's
but
right.
Here's some of the things that work for me, right? Which is a very different conversation. It's when you can take away the panic and take away and some of that, by the way, includes empowering your children to think like a young adult, to start to think their way through things, to empower that thought process for themselves. I tell my sons this frequently. Look, especially my younger ones, I'll say, look, I don't have all the answers, but we are going with mine for now. Right. And so they're kind of like, all right, I get that. Right.
That's
because,
good.
One's 9 and one's 11. Right. So we're not going with your answers. We're going to go with my answers. And I don't always get it right. And so in those moments, I'm teaching my sons authenticity. I'm teaching them that it's okay to not get it right all the time. Like, the pursuit of perfection is burdensome. And to forgive yourself when you don't get it right. Like, you make mistakes. It's okay.
And when you're like that, Gary, guess what? When you are willing to show your authenticity and your weakness and your lack of knowledge in a situation, and that you're still striving to be a good parent and trying to figure it out too, when you're that real with your kid, guess what they give you back? The same thing.
Yeah, they'll be authentic. It's a culture of authenticity. Now, I'll add one little caveat, because some people use this like they're sick and tired of listening to their parents constantly excuse themselves.
Oh.
Right? Because you'll hear that, people will do that. That's why in the book I talked about integrity. You can't continue to just let yourself, it's a fine line, right? You can't just continue to, systematically let yourself off the hook. You need to get yourself on the hook as a parent. But what you're authentic about is the times that you, like I said, you fall off the horse. I'm authentic about those times. But if you're constantly falling off the horse, then there's something for you to deal with there.
That's really good. I remember when my oldest, who's now 25 years old, was like 11 or 12 years old. And this was an aha moment for me at an early stage in my parenting years, right? Which I'm still in.
Yeah.
But I remember one of the things I decided to do was do a father and son interview. It could be a mother, it could be a grandma and grandchild interview, just every quarter, whatever. Hey, just schedule a time when you can just do a one-on-one. We ask corporations to do that all the time, managers and corporations, leaders, so forth. Anyway, so I did that with Bryce when he was 11 or 12 years old. And it typically looked like this. We go in our bedroom. He goes upstairs. We go upstairs to the master bedroom. He sits on the bed. I want to sort of be subordinate. I want him to feel like this is his time. So I typically will kneel down on the floor against the bed and just start chatting with him about what's going on in your life, what's working, what's not working. And I remember this time he started to talk about a girl that he liked who didn't like him, and he was all emotional about it, and he started to get teary-eyed at 12 years old, right? And I was hearing that, and then we were done, and it started to wind down, and I had this thought come in my head, Gary, and the thought was, Bryce, and I asked him this, I said, Bryce, do me a favor. What can I work on as a dad? How can I be a better dad? And I remember he looked at me like, what are you talking about, Dad? You're the best dad in the world, of course, right? That was his natural reaction. But I said, no, I mean it, Bryce. What can I do differently? What do you think? How am I not being the best dad I could be? And I remember that day, sat up in that bed. He looked at me. And he said, Dad, it seems like lately you've been really snappy to the family members. Mm-hmm. And I paused for a minute and I said, you know what, Bryce, you are correct. I have been. You're making me think about it now. And I made a commitment that day that I would work on being snappy, that I'll be more cognizant of some habit or rut I got into to be the better person. I'm telling you, I think, and I truly think this as I sit here today, that was a pivotal moment for him to respect me and me respect him. And today, if he were to come onto this podcast right now, you would see a great relationship between us because I'm not overbearing. I allow freedom for my children. My belief is something that a founder of a religious organization, Joseph Smith, once said. He says, teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves. And I think this is a principle of parenting. Teach the best principles you can that will give them the tools that they'll need to survive in this crazy world. But then you got to allow them to operate on their own to figure that path out.
Yeah. I mean, my middle son, he's a bit of a soccer phenom, this kid, it's one of the reasons why I'm in Germany right now.
Oh, okay.
And he's so active and always going. And and he's got this little attitude about him, and I was raised in an environment where, you better not have an attitude. You can't have that attitude.
Mm.
And one of the days it hit me, I was like, he's going to be a kick-ass man. Like, he's going to really, kick-ass. He's going to be like a real, like, a kid a young man who knows what he wants and knows how he wants it.
Mm-hmm.
And he's very loving, very selfless little boy. But at the same time, like, he had this direction where he was just like, he knew what he wanted. And that changed the way I parented him. When I observed that in him, I was like, I caught myself getting ready to kind of like try and interact with it, and I'm like, no, like, this is him feeling his way in the world. Like, he's kind of finding, his feet here, and very different from my other two boys, very different. And it's funny. I guess that's another thing. Again, this book isn't really about parenting as such, but rather who you are as a parent. But these kind of exercises allow you to see your parenting in a different way. Like I said, I talk about this in the book. Like, I don't have a lot of rules in my, but the rules that I do have, they're there. Like, we don't mess with them, and even when it's inconvenient for me, right?
Yes.
That's the time we're most likely to bend them. By the way, when it's inconvenient for the parent to enforce them. But I do. There are some rules that I have, that I insist upon, and we're not going to mess with those rules. They just are. But I keep them simple. I keep them like a nice framework where everybody can function in and operate in. And so there's I wouldn't say there's chaos. There's no chaos, but there's certainly a lot of freedom for my sons to be boys and be young men. And we'll sort things out as they arise and as they come up. But I'm really a great believer in them finding their voice and finding their expression.
Agreed.
And then then they're really empowered to go live life. You can't check every box with them. You cannot. There's too much to cover. A lot of that they're going to have to figure out for themselves.
My kids, when they graduated from high school, they both went on missions, but when they came home, they did not want to stay home. They were ready to go on to college, become all that they're capable of becoming. That wasn't because we didn't have a good relationship. It's because we taught them over the years to find their own voice. Go be somebody. Go achieve something. Make us proud. But whether you make us proud or not doesn't matter. We will love you the same, whether you succeed or fail. There's always that separation. And you know what? They're doing just fine. They're doing great. And they have figured it out on their own. They don't need me all the time to answer their questions anymore. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Anyway. All right, Gary, listen, we covered a lot here today. I love the 3 heirlooms: be loving, be forgiving, and be someone with integrity. Be vulnerable. Be authentic, just be human, be real. Listen, this book, I agree with you, Gary. It's not just a book about parenting. It is really about seeing your world through a different perspective, realizing maybe some of those core roots and things that impact your world. And in some cases, it may not be serving you. So you give some tools in here on how to change some of those things. But as a result, as you become a better parent, a better person as an individual, more whole, then you have that much more to offer to your children, to your neighbors, to your friend, to society. So I just want to invite everybody, get this book by Gary John Bishop, Grow Up. And you will find, as you read this book, a lot of aha moments throughout this book. And I'm telling you, you will enjoy it. Now, let me ask, any final thoughts? And then if you would, Gary, where should they go to get the book? We'll put the link up here. I want to make sure that people get it.
Well, I always like to leave people with a simple thing, no book will change your life. The only book that changes your life is the one that you do the thinking in.
Yes.
And this book isn't any different. So the gold in this book are the thoughts that you have and the thinking that you do between paragraphs. That's where you'll find the gold. It's not in what I've written. Everything that I've written there is to elicit something. You'll get the juice out of it when you're like, oh, that makes sense. Oh, that now. That's when it'll really start to come alive. So I invite people to take the time to really do that kind of thinking for themselves, to really join the dots for themselves. But anyway, you can find me at GaryJohnBishop.com. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Threads now. I'm still on Facebook. One of the things that I love to do is give people plenty of insights and little notes and stuff like that. So I'm very active on social media, and which is one of the reasons why I'm talking to you, TJ. So there's tons of podcast stuff and all that sort of stuff out there. I'm really committed that people get a lot of this stuff that I'm doing at no charge. So it doesn't cost you any money. You'll find tons of my stuff out there on every subject matter. But this book has been long overdue, and I'm excited for it to finally get out there.
Awesome. Did you mention where they could go to get it? There was a little bit of a snag on the internet there.
So I did not. Sorry. Yeah, it's on Amazon. You can get it on, obviously I did the audiobook too. So you can get it on Audible. Everywhere you can get books, Barnes and Noble, everywhere you can buy books, you'll find your copy of Grow Up.
And I think, and what's awesome about it is it's not a long read, and there's some white space in here. I mean, in a couple sittings, you can have this down, and you pack a punch in the words that are in this book. But I agree with you, it's not the book itself that's going to create the change. It's the thoughts, the ideas, the openness that you're going to have, the thoughts that come to you, the impressions that come to you that cause you to maybe go to someone and forgive them, to say I'm sorry, to maybe take a new action over here. Something that elicits something out of you is what we're hoping for, that you become the person
big time
that you're capable of becoming. Gary, it's been a few years since you were on with me last time around with this book. And
that's right.
What a joy it is to chat with you. And hey, keep up the great work. Thank you for being on the Unleash Your Greatness Within podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, TJ.
You bet. Hey there, what'd you think? Right? I tell you what, I enjoy having Gary on the Unleash Your Greatness Within every time. Let me tell you something. He's thought-provoking. You heard it yourself. Listen, if you enjoyed it, hey, I invite you. If you enjoyed it, hey, subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. Leave a comment if you would. I'd really appreciate it. If you're listening to this because you downloaded it from Apple Podcasts, hey, do me a favor, star it. Let me know how I'm doing. I love having you a part of my community. So hopefully the concepts in this podcast, this video, I hope it impacts your life in a positive way. Now go out there and unleash your greatness within.